Boa tarde a todos, bem-vindos a essa aula magna. Eu sou TJ Demos, meu nome é Rodrigo Sombra, eu sou junto com Lucas Murari, nós somos os curadores dessa mostra. A gente está muito contente de ver casa cheia aqui para ver a fala do TJ. O professor TJ Demos, ele é crítico, historiador da arte, atua também como curador. Ele colabora regularmente com várias revistas de arte muito importantes, como October, Art Forum, Third Text. Escreveu vários livros de peso, livros bastante interessantes. Os mais recentes deles são Decolonizing Nature,
Contra o Antropoceno, também escreveu um dos livros importantes, documentário, documentário mais político, arte mais política, A Imagem Migrante. O professor TJ Demos também publicou um livro, oriundo da dissertação de mestrado dele, que ele realizou em Colômbia, que chama Os Exílios de Marcel Duchamp. São alguns dos vários livros que o professor tem publicado nos últimos anos.
E o TJ acompanha há bastante tempo a obra do John Akomfrah e tem alguns artigos escritos sobre o Akomfrah, entrevistas. Essa questão diaspórica e da migração é muito importante no trabalho dele, desde esse livro que o Lucas citou, Exílios de Marcel Duchamp, mas também esse outro, Migrant Image. E, como a gente dizia, ele é professor da Universidade da Califórnia em Santa Cruz, do Programa de História da Arte e Visual Studies, e ele é diretor do Centro de Ecologias Criativas desta mesma instituição. A gente queria lembrar que o TJ Demos tem 2 textos que foram traduzidos e incluídos no catálogo da Mostra. Para quem não está vindo pela primeira vez ou não sabe, o catálogo pode ser trocado por 2 ingressos na bilheteria do CCBB e a versão digital está disponível online. Então eu queria dar as boas-vindas ao professor TJ Demos.
Thank you very much to Lucas, Rigo, and Pedro for the invitation to come and speak about John Akomfrah's work in Rio. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's great to be with everyone. Thanks for coming out. And I have a text. I'm going to read it, and hopefully the translation will work out. Thanks to the translators for doing this work. And this should be about 50 minutes. So John Akomfrah's moving image art, including his collaboration with Black Audio Film Collective, has long dedicated itself to dismantling the imagined community of nationality, replacing it with works of aesthetic and political disunity, where imagination turns into dissemination, to use Homi Bhabha's memorable terms of the early 1990s, under the pressures of post-colonial experience, particularly in the British context. In his recent work, in its representation of landscapes and ecologies, including non-human agents, such as the foggy atmosphere in All That Is Solid that you see here, a still from 2015, or in Peripatea's stunning skyscapes over the northern English moors from 2016, and in the marine life of his recent film, a 3-channel video installation called Vertigo Sea from 2015, which is not in the retrospective here in Rio because it's quite difficult to install as a 3-channel installation. But I'm going to talk about this film and show some clips from it today. Within this work, there's been a subsequent developing concern with post or non-human sensitivities. So my question is, how might we develop methodologies of analysis for moving image art that opens itself to diverse territories and the politics of matter, from the post-colonial to the more than human? An arc that appears conflictual in many ways. So this essay explores Akomfrah's moving image practice in Britain since the early 1980s, which focuses on diasporic Black British cultural production attentive to post-colonial experience. I'm interested in how rifts in the national narrative were long the focus of Akomfrah's and other like-minded and allied practices, including those of Isaac Julian and Sankofa, Sato Film and Video Workshop, Retake, and the work of Mona Hatoum, among others. Many were associated with the Black workshop movement of the time in Britain. Supported by Channel 4 television, this is a public television channel in Britain, and the Greater London Council. During the years of Thatcher's conservatism, and following a series of racially intoned uprisings and conflicts, responding to British socioeconomic inequality and forms of police brutality. Partly in response to films like Signs of Empire from 1984, and Hansworth's Songs of 1986, Twilight City of 1989, and many others. All of those films have been screened in this retrospective. Akomfrah and others emphasize the diasporic and intersectionalist territories of race, class, gender, and sexuality as sites of crisis and contradiction that rupture nationality and its progressive temporality, rendering any proposal to read such work according to a national framework rather than an insistently international and diasporic one, challenged at best, and at the very least demanding particular sensitivity and complexity. If the nation's cultural and political geography risks a homogenizing lens that represents an inadequate contextualizing methodology for reading moving image practice, which we've learned from such authors as Kobena Mercer, who spoke in Brazil as part of the earlier series of this retrospective. Then in recent years, it's emerged conversely as too limited. That is, too limited not only in terms of post-colonial diaspora's expanding geographies that transgress national boundaries, such as the history of forced displacement under slavery over centuries of imperialism and colonialism in Africa. This is expressed in the recent works of John Akomfrah and a younger generation of artists, such as the London-based Autolith Group, which have begun to investigate also ecological matters of concern at the global level, set within expansive non-human territories and post-anthropocentric temporalities. So, in other words, I'm interested in this presentation about how Akomfrah's work has moved from an occupation with migration and race and colonialism and post-colonialism to a concern with the environment, with ecology, with relations to the non-human realm. Okay, so that's the development that we can see, one important development in John Akomfrah's work. So with these dual concerns of moving image practices in Britain, highlighting the post-colonial or decolonial and the post-human, we face multiple problems of scale, both of time and space, as well as agency and impact, which has in fact been made into a problem of aesthetics, of art, by many of these practitioners under consideration here. In other words, how to express in filmic form the splits and disunities and conflicts of post-colonial national crisis and post-human social formation. So as I'll argue, in distinction to much object-oriented art and speculative realist philosophy, which has emerged in recent years, it's a very important international philosophical trend. These practices, including Akomfrah's, are importantly distinguished by their refusal to cut ties to human-oriented political concerns, marked by the history of racism, slavery, and colonialism, even as they investigate non-human causalities and environments, proposing compelling models of complexly politicized new materialisms, which provokes an additional question for historians and critics of the moving image: how to construct genealogies of cinematic practice in relation to time and space, and in relation to the intersecting realms of human and non-human natures, at a time of threatening climate change and racially inscribed political and economic inequalities. So these challenges are poignantly addressed, I believe, in John Akomfrah's Vertigo Sea, which is a 3-channel video installation. This is a still of it, produced for the 2015 Venice Biennale, that investigates the ocean as a multivalent site of geopolitical conflict, liquid nationality, and post-national uprooting, in still unfolding histories of colonialism, migration, slavery, and environmental transformation. Over the course of the 48 minutes of the film, filled with lush imagery, some drawn from the BBC archives, including footage from David Attenborough's sumptuous sea life documentary, The Blue Planet, which is from 2001. Viewers experience an oceanic disorientation, advanced by signs and evidence of the spread of capitalism's commodification and industrialization of the seas via factory ship whaling, extractive fields for deep water oil drilling, leaks and fiery explosions, and the ocean's militarization via nuclear testing. In addition, there are many symptoms of climate change and global warming in scenes of melting and calving glaciers, which counterpoint shots of the sea as a mass grave, from which the bodies of countless Europe-bound migrants wash up on the shore, dead but ever mediagenic. To these moving images, the film adds footage shot by Akomfrah, portraying dramatizations of Olaudah Equiano, who's a freed African slave and abolitionist who traveled the seas and explored the Arctic and lived out his 18th century life in England, writing an important autobiography in which the ocean figures as a place of multiple valences, a terrain of wondrous beauty and sublime exploration, as much as an existential threat and watery captivity. So this is a historical painting of Equiano. And this is how Equiano appears in Akomfrah's Vertigo Sea. So Vertigo Sea's triple visual montage is redoubled in the soundtrack, where breathy strings of majestic and foreboding affect combine with whale song, interrupted at times by the echoing shots of hunting rifles and the blasts of harpoon cannons seeking polar bears and whales. Delivered from an artistic position outside of hegemonic British identity that tends to focus on whiteness, Vertigo C builds a story of empire formation, and subjective displacement, one remembered in the interests of illuminating the complexities of and contesting present-day nationalism and xenophobia. The anti-migrant ire, of which tends to forget Britain's historical role in producing social diversity through imperial conquest. In turning to the current environmental crisis, the artist's earlier engagements are not lost, only extended into watery coordinates beyond Britain's borders, while also recalling the erstwhile global expansiveness of the British Empire, on which there's a famous old slogan, the sun never sets on the British Empire. That's because the British Empire is everywhere and it's always illuminated during the day. Which was the immediate subject of Akomfrah's earlier work. Still, what is striking in Vertigo C is Akomfrah's advancement into territories beyond the sole focus on cultures of race and diaspora, even those concerns are still present. But what's notable in the film's sensitivity to the more than human web of life that lives and dies in the vast oceans, as well as the icy objectivity of glaciers and the geological materiality and agency of the Arctic realm, expressed in audiovisual terms that fall outside of the human language of voiceover or interpretive text, even if captured in conventional representational visual systems. Consequently, we lose our familiar anthropocentric bearings with its vertiginous portrayals, which push us into unknown experiential and thus methodological terrains. One's only just now beginning to be mapped and theorized within the philosophical practices of speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, and new materialisms. So with Vertigo C, Akomfrah importantly contributes to the call to create desperately needed geo-stories, or stories of the Earth, tales of humans' inseparability from Earth's history, or as the theorist Donna Haraway, sorry, some of this is cut off, unfortunately. As Donna Haraway writes, multi-species stories and practices of becoming with in times that remain at stake. At a moment when human exceptionalism and bounded individualism, those old saws of Western philosophy and political economics, become unthinkable in the best science. The video has indeed much to tell as we enter into an unfolding present in the realization of post-anthropocentric ecological reciprocities. If we are living through a geological turn, then we're faced with the question of how to retain our earthly status. That is, how to define cultural values of being human. At a time when the interpenetration of the human, cultural, and ahuman geological milieus is stretching our definition of self-interest to include the flourishing of the complex systems of biogeological processes, such that we require a new narrative as a nation and as a species that encompasses the expanse of planetary time. So, providing one response to these searching questions, Vertigo C offers much insight for how we might narrate moving image practices within the geologic now, when migration must be thought together with climate change, and environmentalism with histories of slavery and racism, lest they repeat their problematic compartmentalizations. We know that narrating the nation entails producing an imagined community for which the historian Benedict Anderson, in his classic definition in the book Imagined Communities, detailed the inherent but necessary fictions, its phantasmic unity merged with nativity, its post-dynastic modernity predicated on the collective obligation to forget, both difference and the violence that went into its mythological construction. But what happens to nationality when its cohesion is challenged by the counter-narration of minor and minoritarian histories, as well as supervening and non-human ones? As Homi Bhabha asked in his formative criticism of the links between nation and narration during the 1990s, what might be the cultural and political effects of the liminality of the nation, the margins of modernity, which cannot be signified without the narrative temporalities of splitting, ambivalence, and vacillation? That question can be updated in our current and conflictual context of the Anthropocene, or Capitalocene, as some prefer, where the boundaries between nature and culture become indiscernible. So what might be the cultural and political effects of the liminality of the human, the margins of the geologic, which cannot be signified without the narrative temporalities of expansiveness, reciprocity, and post-anthropocentrism? As Akomfrah's work demonstrates, the cultural and political effects of investigating that spatio-temporal liminality or fluidity of the nation are not to reinforce the logic of nationality, but instead to continually identify its points of rupture, the violence of its non-cohesion, and the historical traumas and repressions of its social impacts on both human subjects within and outside empire, and the non-human environments and biodiverse forms of life on which the nation is often violently overlaid. As Homi Bhabha noted, how easily that boundary that secures the cohesive limits of the Western nation may imperceptibly turn into a contentious internal liminality that provides a place from which to speak both of and as the minority, the exilic, the marginal, and the emergent. Yet in Akomfrah's example, that turn, registered again and again in his practice, from Handsworth Songs to Vertigo Sea, has been far from imperceptible. Rather, like other work being considered here, his turn to the minority and the exilic and the marginal and the emergent has been consistently resolute and decisive, if also marked by its development from the post-colonial to the post-human. Creating a genealogy for Akomfrah's recent work, we must find first a return to the formative 1980s, where there emerged in Black British filmmaking an expanding collective focus on considering the tumultuous legacy of empire and diasporic post-colonial Britain from an experimental approach. The richness of that context has been pointed out and addressed by Kobena Mercer, among others, who has importantly brought out the efforts of practitioners to deepen, extend, and transform still earlier modes of representation of racial politics by such directors as Horace Ove and Lionel Ngakane and Menelik Shabazz in the 1960s and 70s. For Mercer, he writes, "Until now, in 1994, Black film in Britain has emphasized the radical content of its political message over the politics of representation inherent in the medium. Certain aesthetic qualities generated by the self-consciously cinematic strategies at work in new forms of Black filmmaking today, however, indicate significant shifts and critical differences in attitudes to the means of representation." So Cobain-Mercer is saying that with Akomfrah's work, we're moving from the conventional representation of politics to considerations of the politics of representation. This aesthetic shift is clear not only in Black Audio Film Collective's beginnings, especially with their scripto-visual slideshow pieces like Expeditions, Signs of Empire, and Expeditions 2, Images of Nationality, expressed through anti-colonial, archival, and montage-based constructions, as well as in Isaac Julian's early filmmaking practice, such as his short documentary Territories of 1984. This is a still from Territories, which investigated, as the artist's voiceover explains, the intersectionalist geographies of the post-colony, the territories of class, labor, race, sex relations, territory, the holding of one's class privilege in a declining system of crisis, territories of desire, the control of one's space, carnival, territory of resistance, sound systems, territories of surveillance of the mind, territory of sexual expression of the body, the contradictory spaces, the geographical expressions that cohabit a city and that structure a nation. That's Isaac Julian. In his 1994 book, Welcome to the Jungle, and in particular the chapter Diaspora, Culture, and the Dialogic Imagination, the Aesthetics of Black Independent Film in Britain, Cobain-Mercer argued that Julian's montage aesthetic is productively informed by early 20th century avant-garde formations, specifically those of Mikhail Bakhtin and his notion of the dialogic principle, which allows us to better comprehend Black British artistic practices of what Cobain-Mercer calls the critically carnivalesque. In regards to Territories, he emphasized the film's, in his words, its choral refrain. We are struggling to tell a story, a history, a her story, which underlies the fact that its story does not arrive at a point of closure, and this deferral of any authoritative resolution to the issues it raises implies that the spectator shares active responsibility for making semantic connections between the multi-accentuated elements of the image flow. So these points link up with the discussion of Akomfrah's work and indicate that a powerful cinematic formation emerged in the early 1980s in Britain. One that, though only glimpsed in this discussion, advances further its moving image practices today. The formation identifies a long-standing concern of British moving image practice, which develops a poetics of displacement. Displacement from national belonging, from essentialist monocultures, from representational solidity, from aesthetic purities, that challenges the contextualizing framework of nationality, both from beneath and above. I'd like to focus on a second critical approach to Akomfrah's more recent work now, which addresses how his work resonates with what the emergent environmental humanities have called the geological turn, informed by a growing preoccupation with our present ecological crisis. This is driven by both practice and theory, as in recent conceptual developments in speculative realist and object-oriented philosophies. So these are philosophies that attempt to address the existence of the world beyond the human. So what is the reality or the ontological being of stones or a river or plants or the earth? Right? How can we think beyond human epistemology? So these are especially philosophies that are attentive to an aesthetics and politics of matter or materiality, and are advanced in environmental science and feminist science studies, particularly those organized around the Anthropocene thesis. This geologic term, datable to the last 10 or so years, has pushed some moving image practice and discourse into post-anthropocentric areas of exploration. And this is really an important development. In other words, we have to abandon our long-standing position within anthropocentrism, where the human being is first and foremost. And how can we begin to understand our position in a world of multi-species being within a broader web of life where humans aren't sovereign? These models correlate with the logical incompatibility between categories of race and nationality expressed by Mercer and Paul Gilroy. But in Akomfrah's examples, they advance them further into altogether different discordancies of scale. Here, the sense of mutual exclusivity between the human and non-human, between culture and nature, between bounded individualism and multi-species assemblage, can be seen as among the essential conditions for the hegemony of anthropocentrism over humanity's, or at least Western modernity's, collective consciousness. So how did new moving image explorations surpass this hegemony and negotiate the conceptualizations of what, for instance, the feminist science studies researcher and writer Karen Barad calls post-binary space-time mattering? That's her term. How do they produce radical expressions of indeterminacy beyond the territories of division and conflict? And how do they pose new ways of conceiving the being of matter and the earth, or what the anthropologist Elizabeth Pavanelli would call geontologies, making intraactive cuts that reveal nature cultures that are becoming incomprehensible according to the outmoded Holocene logics. So geontologies is an important theoretical development that attempts to look at the being of the earth and how politics increasingly is directed at governing the boundaries between life and non-life. So for instance, when we have arguments between indigenous peoples who believe that plants, animals, and water, sometimes stone, are living or are alive or filled with animism or spirit, this is a geontological difference and conflict posed against Western modernity and capitalism that tend to see water, forests, trees as commodity objects. So I think, as you can see in Peripetea, Akomfrah's work is increasingly looking at landscapes, the natural world, rivers, seas, plants, ecology. So I'm interested in how this ecological sensibility functions in relationship to his work. Whereas you can see at the same time that he's considering the natural world, he's refusing to lose his focus as well on past forms of colonial violence, slavery, and racism. So how does the insistently non-anthropocentric focus of these nature cultures and space-time matterings within the wider discourse of new materialisms and object-oriented philosophies potentially overlook or disavow the human-centered political histories of colonialism and racism in the former's efforts to foreground areas of speculation beyond the human?
In this regard, the work of the African-American poet and Black studies theorist Fred Moten has been key to resisting that potential depoliticization, precisely by insisting on exploring the aesthetico-political conditions of subjectivity within objecthood, especially as revealed in slavery's objectifications, and equally the objection of the human within commodified and racialized bondage. So as such, we need to take seriously the political and cultural disjunctions of those histories as explored in moving image practices in Britain and beyond, particularly those that similarly insist on expressing sensitivity to human narratives of race and slavery, which simultaneously inform and respond to investigations into the wider environmental circumstances and politics of matter. So to further develop the discussion, I'd like to briefly contextualize Akomfrah's work in relationship to some younger generations of artists who have benefited greatly from his example, specifically the Aula group, which is a London-based collective that makes films, which has also organized important retrospective and a catalog of Black audio film collectives' art in London in 2007. So let's consider the Aula group's film The Radiant from 2012. This is a clip from that film, which investigates the representational challenges posed by Fukushima's 2011 triple catastrophe of earthquake, tsunami, and triple-core nuclear meltdown. The film takes up the challenge of how to portray and express the agency of non-human elements, such as water and flooding, or radiation, doing so in Fukushima's containment zone, an environment of radiological danger that excludes the human, at least its sustainable living existence. More, it asks how we can develop a post-anthropocentric perceptual sensorium in an experimental filmic mode that also rejects outmoded nature culture and human, non-human binaries. The motivation is compelling. Recalibrating our approach to nature cultures can help avoid future disasters that occur when non-human agents, whether in the form of tsunamis or earthquakes, nuclear meltdowns, or radiation drift, cause havoc within human infrastructure and public health and ecosystem functioning. Systems that many naively consider immune to such disturbances, whether owing to climate change denialism or the complacency of faith in modern technologies. And also, further, can we map these sensitivities to the geological realm in terms of the latter's magnified scales of temporality and space? How can we map those onto the cultural conflicts that transform natural disasters into human disasters? So, for instance, we know with Fukushima that the radiation spill will potentially last for hundreds of thousands of years and is still a conflict, it's still a crisis that is continuing to overspill and potentially corrupt and pollute the Pacific Ocean. So in The Radiant, we learn how the Fukushima calamity has exacerbated numerous socioeconomic and political divisions between workers and management of the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which runs the Fukushima reactor, and between community members and industry, between disenfranchised local citizens and elite government officials based in Tokyo, and between elderly forgotten people, as they're called, who continue to live in the sacrifice exposure zone of radiation, and younger generations suddenly displaced from their homes. In other words, advancing tropes characteristic as well in Akomfrah's older and recent cinema, The Radiant presents the ghosts of post-colonial concerns, alert to repressed symptoms of inequality, violence, and trauma, and connects to the geological disruptions affecting and exceeding the human. Or we can consider the Autolith Group's film Medium Earth from 2013, which is similarly attentive to non-human geographies and ecologies. The film explores the territories of earthquake fault lines in California as a geosymptomatology of earth writing. So it's as if the fault lines are a kind of earth language. With each trace in the region's topography sending a signal to select human readers. The language of cracks and fissures in rock correspond to a geological medium in which some humans in the film claim to be sensitive and literate, according to which a coming tectonic rift in one region of the world will be felt as a painful sensation in a particular part of one's body, and as such can be read as an anticipatory sign of near-future seismic activity. The film itself offers a meditative, perceptual experience of the landscape, portraying scenes of interconnecting plate tectonics set in the California desert, the motions of which create sounds at subsonic levels. The rumblings of straining and compressing rocks that evoke the symptoms and language of geological testimony, legible to earthquake sensitives. These people appear as the vanguard speakers and translators of a post-anthropocentric community, attuned to the geosemiotics of the more than human realm. While race may not be directly foregrounded here, we do encounter an exploration of the intimate connections between geology and human culture, focusing on a geography once populated with indigenous presence, even if it remains implicit within the film. With a voiceover that speaks of faults and their painful system of hurtful stresses, the film nonetheless elicits invisible and unspecified social traumas, broken geographies of violence that nonetheless resonate with the disjunctive social topographies of Isaac Julian's Territories or Black Audio Film Collective's Handsworth songs. These sensitivities to the geological, to its geo-chorus of phonic murmurings, to the choreography of stone, to non-human earth language, including those that speak of past violence, are also addressed in Akomfrah's Vertigo Sea. This is a short clip from Vertigo Sea. Albeit in ways that are specific more to water than to desert rock. Exploring what the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson termed the sublime seas, a notion quoted in the film, suggesting an expanded lineage of poetic environmental consciousness. The film offers a new focus on an updated politics of migration, in addition to its ecology of non-human space, and the way that those fields interact. The film considers how the environment provides a sublime, allegorical container for the epic journey of the displaced, and how the migrant has become a force and affect of modernity, one that has left traces and often scars of violence on the earth, sinking into its watery surfaces and depths, and on its non-human life forms. Vertigo Sea takes the expanded space and extended temporalities of the sea, what the eco-critic Timothy Morton might call a hyper-object. A hyper-object is an object that expands beyond human sensibility in relationship to space and time. It takes hyper-objects of the sea as its subject, which, owing to its unbounded scale and geological time, displaces human epistemologies and representational capacities from centrality. Akomfrah attempts nonetheless to subject the hyper-object to a frame, which is no easy and even an ultimately impossible task. According to the monumentalizing terms of his triptych-based model of expanded cinema and use of spectacular imagery, which proposed a scenography of modern geosocial history, both beautiful and terrible. In doing so, Vertigo C doesn't shirk from showing us the unparalleled splendor of aquatic nature. But rather than a collapse into consumerist nature porn, the film, I would argue, represents a courageous act of refusing contemporary cultural cynicism, the kind that has given up on beauty, even while it rightfully sees beauty itself as threatened, if not thoroughly colonized, by media spectacle and commodification. Still, the film's efforts to decolonize nature, to rescue it from capitalist subjection, may court the risk of being accused of naive aestheticization and a hackneyed political ecological maneuver in critically juxtaposing nature and human beauty with dreadful scenes of industrial exploitation. Yet nature, one might rightfully respond, is intrinsically aesthetic, and beauty a part of life itself, a means of both non-human survival and enjoyment, as science has demonstrated, which Akomfrah portrays in its fullest glory. On the other hand, the film glimpses the destruction of that beauty, positioning aesthetic delectation as that which accompanies and mediates the destruction of species, the violence of climate change, and the mass death of migrants, all portrayed through stimulating visual presentation, although those scenes aren't in this clip here. Might this filmic construction be but one integral part of the very grotesque attempt at dominating nature? In other words, is the beautification of the sea within nature documentaries, is that part of a grotesque domination and colonization of nature? If so, then Akomfrah's efforts are potentially doomed. But perhaps that's the very lesson of the film. While it looks back at the 19th century origins of an industrial civilization on fire and plunging blindly into darkness, as the writer C.L.R. James notes of Melville's classic book Moby Dick, in James's 1953 book Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, Akomfrah shows how that runaway conflagration previews contemporary environmental catastrophe, which it appears can only be shown, understood, and challenged via complex aesthetic engagement. So there's something key in this vertiginous sea of philosophical speculation that the film initiates about our contemporary relation and response to violence, whether ecological or human. When our image-saturated media invites us to enjoy scenes of violence through their movie-like aestheticization, it's of course intolerable. That intolerability, as the French philosopher Jacques Rancière has noted in related contexts, identifies not only the unbearable reality that such images show, but also the numbing, anesthetizing capacity of such images, which can only be excoriating. Vertigo C interrogates both aspects, showing their logics at work in scenes of slavery, ecocide, and involuntary migration. Doing so, it provokes a reconfiguration of the visible without any simple lesson, even as its geo-story presents an entanglement of nature cultures that assume aesthetic expression for a new post-anthropocentric sensibility. It insists upon drawing histories of colonialism and empire into proximity with current neoliberal planetary modes of violence, where migration and climate change are understood as forces propelled by current corporate state powers. I'm almost done here. This is my conclusion. So those powers of corporate and state powers are wreaking havoc not only on disenfranchised peoples in situations of socioeconomic precarity, especially in the global south, but also increasingly in the north as well. But they're also wreaking havoc on the Earth's biodiversity, set within the context of the current mass species extinction event, about which Akomfrah's film speaks eloquently and gravely. His work invites our historiographic models, then, to adapt and evolve accordingly, which is what I'm trying to do in my research. Such that we begin to speak of what it means to move from Holocene methodologies of interpretation to those of the Capitalocene or Anthropocene or the Thulucene, the latter being Donna Haraway's proposal for the era of multi-species being. With that ambition in mind, these models of practice define new filmic modelings appropriate for a new geological epoch, whatever its name. They do so by engaging with and building upon and problematizing emerging areas of theoretical analysis found in the articulations of new materialism, object-oriented ontologies, and speculative realism, even while they refuse to forget earlier lessons of anti-colonial practice and reason. Equally, they render earlier critical postmodernisms and identity politics and post-colonial theories both as still relevant and urgent, and yet partially outmoded by their very inadvertent anthropocentrism. With these practices, we can continue to build new modalities of intersectionalist interpretation that are at once aesthetically attuned, ecologically aware, and politically engaged. Thank you very much.
Alguém teria algum comentário, alguma observação, alguma questão para o professor?
Bom, obrigado pela aula e parabéns pela mostra. Muito interessante descobrir a arte do Akomfrah. Eu assisti 2 filmes, 9 Musas, e me impressionou bastante, e pela beleza intensa as imagens que ele produz. A minha pergunta é: qual foi a formação dele, o Akomfrah? Como ele chegou a esse cinema? Quem formou ele? Quais influências que ele recebeu? E o trabalho dele com as citações literárias e as imagens que ele faz, pelo menos no 9 Musas, que me impressionou bastante. E o outro filme, Genoma, também, muito impressionante. Obrigado.
Thanks for the question. Akomfrah's he went to film school in Britain in the early 80s, and that's where he, together with a number of other people, founded Black Audio Film Collective. So he has a background in filmmaking, the technical and formal aspects of what it means to make documentaries, but also, as I briefly alluded to in my essay, he's very extremely educated in relationship to avant-garde history. So when he approaches documentary filmmaking, he's also, within his work with Black Audio Film Collective and in his solo career subsequently, insisting on creatively intervening in documentary practice. So he's bringing together avant-garde modes of aesthetic experimentation with documentary modes of storytelling. And that's that documentary fictional aspect, the blurring the boundaries between those categories that people normally think of as oppositional between the fictional and the documentary. But this is something that he's particularly known for in his work. But you're right in pointing out the kind of practice of the quotational, which he also advances in his work in a number of films, but The Nine Muses is really, I think, very strong in this, which shows his really quite impressive, incredible education within the history of Western philosophy, Western literature, aesthetics, going back to classicism. So I think that really is clear in The Nine Muses. But at the same time, I've always been impressed and have learned. I've known John for about 15 years, and I've always been impressed by his education of worldly, colonial and post-colonial history, and also politics and theory. So he's very cosmopolitan and has done a lot, I think, of continual research and study throughout his life to reach the point of being so erudite and knowing and aware of developments all over the world in relationship to history and culture and politics. He's had no, I think, formal training in or advanced graduate education in philosophy or literature. It's work that I think he's done very much on his own.
Alguém mais queria alguma outra pergunta? Comentário, alguma observação?
Oi. Queria agradecer, na verdade, eu acho, não sei para o resto da plateia, mas para mim é um universo de debate conceitual, inclusive, que se abre. Talvez eu ainda seja muito antropocêntrica, não estou ainda no pós-antropocentrismo, mas você comentou em algum momento, mais no final da sua fala, das críticas que o trabalho, né, acaba recebendo, uma certa estetização da natureza. Enfim, eu queria que você falasse um pouco mais sobre essas críticas e dar resposta um pouco do Akomfrah para isso.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And yeah, this is a recent paper that I recently wrote, and it's going to be published in Britain. So I apologize if it was a little too formal.
The mic's good. Can you change the mic?
Yeah, it's not working. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll just repeat that. This is current research that I'm preparing for publication. So I apologize if it was a little bit too formal. But hopefully we can. If you have any questions, I'm really happy to talk about everything. But the issue of aestheticization and beauty, I think, it's a major concern in his work. And I don't know how he personally would answer that question. I would be curious. I haven't spoken to him recently, but that's something I would like to ask him. But he knows about what I'm trying to do in my reading of his work, and he hasn't disagreed with it. So what I'm trying to do is to look at aesthetics or aestheticization as a problem area. It's a problem space in his work. I don't think he's simply producing beautiful film for the sake of visual spectacle. I think there's something more thoughtful and complex going on there, which I'm trying to express in the paper, which is to locate beauty in relationship to destruction. Right? We're living at a time when we're facing the potential end of the world, or a climate-based catastrophe. that is related to the mass extinction of species. We're living through a period that scientists now are claiming is a mass species extinction event. The last one was 65 million years ago. So how can you represent the death of species, which is a profound impoverishment of our world? How can you represent that in a way that's beautiful? That's kind of perverse and grotesque. And I think he's thinking about this and contemplating it in his work in a way that the very beautiful representation of the sea, which is being industrialized and militarized and polluted, right? In its beauty, he's showing that beautification to be itself a form of violence. So it's both visually stunning and it's profoundly disturbing. I think he's bringing those two together and attempting to open this up for a kind of experience and philosophical speculation, but also there's a political insight here where acts of destruction become beautiful. We're familiar with this from the history, for instance, of fascism, right? Fascism, according to the German Jewish critic Walter Benjamin, he argued that fascism, in Nazi fascism, this is the first time when humans experience their self-destruction as beautiful. So I think Akomfrah is definitely aware of that history. And I think he's addressing this condition of beauty within a kind of complex dialectical framework, where beauty and destruction are held in either hand and continually refer to one another. I hope that addresses, at least begins to address that complicated question.
Vou testar, alô, testando.
Alguma outra pergunta?
Eu queria fazer uma pergunta. Tem gente na minha frente?
A levantaram a mão quase um pouquinho antes de você, depois. Obrigado.
Vem primeiro?
Alô, queria que você falasse um pouco mais sobre a perspectiva dualista dele. Você tinha dito sobre ver os objetos, né, e os objetos não teriam exatamente uma diferença com o ser humano, como se eles tivessem algum tipo de, sei, um não totemismo, assim, como se eles tivessem uma espécie de espírito. Se você pudesse falar um pouco mais sobre isso e se é possível traçar uma origem desse tipo de pensamento ou algum outro paralelo, algum outro cineasta paralelo que esteja trabalhando com esse tipo de conceito hoje em dia. Porque eu vejo uma semelhança no que você disse no trabalho da Akomfrah, da Chicago, e também contemporâneo. Obrigado.
Sure, thank you. I think that you're asking about the recent development of what we might call speculative realist philosophy or object-oriented ontologies. This is a movement in philosophy that's been developing internationally. In Europe, in North America, I'm sure in South America as well. Probably, I know there's some thinking about this in Brazil, for instance, in the work of Eduardo Viveiros de Castro and Deborah Danowski. So the question in this work, I mean, it's very complex and it's debated and internally differentiated. But one of the central questions is how can we consider the world beyond the human without thinking through human categories or human forms of representation and ways of knowing. Right? How can we think about being and the non-human world of animals, of plants, of nature, of rivers, of seas, but without focusing on and reinforcing human epistemologies or anthropocentrism. So I think the problem that I'm seeing in this development, and that other people have pointed out, the problem is that in certain articulations of this philosophy, you lose a relation to human politics. There's no discussion of the political within object-oriented ontologies, at least according to some versions. Like I'm thinking of Graham Harman and Nick Snerzek and a range of other people. And they, in some essays, they actually say this, that they're not interested in the human realm. In fact, they want to move beyond it to consider objecthood and materiality, materiality beyond the human. So I found it really interesting to consider, as I mentioned in the essay, the work of someone like Fred Moten, who takes up this question in a way that that the Indian-American philosopher Gayatri Spivak asked, which is, can the subaltern speak? Right? Can the subaltern speak? Can those who are dispossessed and disenfranchised, can they have a voice, or are they always spoken for? And Fred Moten asked the question, can the object speak? Right? Can the object speak? Not the human, but the object. This is a question that object-oriented ontology is also asking. But Moten, who's African-American, and very attentive to the history of race and black studies and slavery, points out the fact that the human itself is a conflicted category, and in fact there are a whole category of persons who were excluded from subjectivity, who were effectively seen as objects, like slaves. Slaves were commodity objects. So he's asking the question, can the object speak, and locating his discussion within the history of slavery, and saying, yes, the object can speak. And when you listen to the object, typically they're not speaking, they're screaming. And he has an amazing analysis of this in his book, In the Break. Fred Moten. In his book, In the Break. So that's I find that a really compelling and inspiring and traumatic discussion. And he relates it to jazz, which is really fascinating. So I'm trying to develop that discussion and relate it again and allow it to enter into dialogue with Akomfrah's work in terms of addressing that question of a more complex and racially attuned and repoliticized object-oriented ontology. So Fred Moten is he offers a mode of speculative realism that insists on an intersectionalist political relation. So I'm really compelled by that.
Obrigado pela, assim, essa aula magnífica, para o momento que o Rio de Janeiro vive, para o momento que o Brasil vive, quando você fala do Benjamin, do fascismo, e essa pleiade, esse conjunto de situações que esse autor mostra e fala, que vai do crescendo do homem à natureza. Eu queria perguntar assim o seguinte, a barbárie que se instalou no homem, né? A gente vive num país bárbaro, que não respeita o próximo, um racismo muito grande, um país muito sexista. E aí, parece que o ser humano, ele vai num crescendo, que ele sai do homem e destruindo totalmente a natureza, de uma forma brutal. E nesse filme, documentário agora, fica bem claro isso. A apropriação brutal dos grandes conglomerados, das multinacionais. Eu queria que você falasse um pouco, parece que isso perdeu o controle. E o que eu gostei demais é que, no momento em que o país passa por um momento de retorno a uma ditadura. A gente já está vivendo um momento de um estado de exceção. O CCBB, que é essa instituição que aqui estou, eu não sei se hipocritamente ou não, ela mostra para determinadas pessoas que estão aqui um conteúdo contundente desse, que tem bastante a cara do país que eu vivo. Muito obrigada.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you for the comment.
Crescendo, que foi do homem, o crescendo. Por favor, a questão, que o pano de fundo é a minha indignação quanto à questão que a gente vive, e é muito claro isso no filme, no documentário. E a questão que eu também coloquei é que me pareceu que foi do homem, assim, a brutal desrespeito ao ser, que Merleau-Ponty fala, o outro está em mim, e chega à brutal destruição da natureza. É nesse sentido que eu fiz essa pergunta.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Acho que ele não entendeu qual era a pergunta.
Não tem pergunta, né?
Sei que no Brasil a gente vê o Pedro de Castro abordando, né? Eu queria compreender um pouco melhor a genealogia como método. E aí, assim, queria entender de que maneira ela se aproxima ou se distancia da ideia de arqueologia do Foucault ou da leitura da história a contrapelo do Walter Benjamin. Essa é uma parte. E aí, como é que ela lida também, se ela tem alguma coisa de linear, né, com esse aparente paradoxo que é olhar para uma temporalidade na perspectiva não progressiva que você colocou, que são os filmes do Akomfrah, né, que ele tenta fazer esse movimento disruptivo de olhar para outras possibilidades de temporalidade. É porque, né, eu fiquei pensando isso, assim, como isso funciona como método para olhar para os filmes e para outras obras.
Thanks for that question. I'll try to address it in one way, which is what's the genealogy? Well, it's certainly not a linear model of time where we move beyond the past and we enter into the present, and then the past is in the past and it's over and done with, and we can focus on the present. So in that sense, if we look at the Vertigo Sea as an example, right? The sea is a place of, on the one hand, marine life and flourishing biodiversity. In a way, that's the focus of David Attenborough's film, Blue Planet. But when Akomfrah insists on thinking about and looking at the sea as a grave, right? As a grave, he's refusing to forget the history of the violence, the tremendous traumatic and tragic violences of the past, right? In relationship to transmigration, in relationship to transatlantic slavery, in relationship to all the people who have lost their lives within the sea, in relationship to all the people who continue to die trying to gain access to countries like in Europe. So he's in other words, he's insisting on a complex temporality that I think is genealogical in the sense that it's non-linear, it's not progressive, and it insists on bringing into visuality the traumas and the tragedies of the past, because ultimately they're not past. I think that would be the political approach to his film. He's refusing to follow the trend of environmentalism say, of today that tends to separate the environment as if it's a matter of nature. And he's insisting on an intersecting field of the natural and the cultural, of migration, of slavery, of international trade, of globalization, of colonization. He's insisting on thinking those together with an interest in marine biology and natural sciences. And I think that's really compelling and important, that interdisciplinarity or cross-disciplinary thinking. So he's refusing what in English we use the word silos, where knowledge can be compartmentalized, and we look at this in relationship to science, and then we look at that in relationship to politics, right? He's bringing the two together, and I think that's a political act. That's an ethical political act. So I think that's really crucial.
Seria então mais complexo que olhar como simplesmente uma justa oposição do tempo, dos temas, né?
It's a juxtaposition, but maybe the problem with the reason I'm not using the word juxtaposition is because it might assume that there's prior separate knowledges, whereas for him, and I think I would want to argue that from the very beginning things are in relation. Things are always happening in there's no notion of a discrete, pure category to begin with. Things are always in a relationality that is formative to the very beginning of their being. That makes sense, like, philosophically. These are great questions.
Hi, thank you very much. You have mentioned Waldo Emerson, because I found it very difficult, much too complex for me and highly philosophical, so I could not link the idea of deculturalization and post-colonial studies with the beauty of the sea. Okay, now it's getting a little bit clearer, right? And I'd like to ask you whether we can connect then this philosophy with transcendentalism, which is, very present in Waldo Emerson.
Yeah, I think unfortunately I can't. Vertigo C is more than an hour long, so I can't show everything. I only have that one clip. But in stills like this, you can see. I mean, that's not a transcendentalist aesthetic philosophy that he's presenting here. Maybe the images on the right in relationship to the sublime sunset, but the image on the left, this is a famous photograph of a slave within North America, and it comes from the archive of that violent history within the U.S. So again, I think Akomfrah is, and this comes back to the first question that was asked. I mean, he's really interested in making this extremely wide and diverse range of quotations that brings up an expansive archaeology of knowledge that includes Emerson and transcendentalist philosophy, that includes the history of classical philosophy and literature throughout the ages. And I think he's bringing it up in order to draw on different realms of experience and knowledge. Again, he's continually resistant himself to being categorized. I think as if a black British artist can only deal with black British literature, or Ghanaian philosophy. Right? I mean, he's insisting on access to a migratory and hybrid knowledge base. So in the case of transcendentalism, I think this is a great example of the refusal to think about transcendentalism without also thinking about the violence and the savagery of human forms of exploitation.
pergunta? A gente ainda tem tempo. Alguém mais queria fazer alguma pergunta? Ou a gente pode...
São duas coisas mais voltadas para o começo, então, da sua apresentação. É quando você fala de uma transição no trabalho do Akomfrah, né? De algum modo eu compreendo que é uma transição do cinema para as artes visuais, muito no sentido também que o Isaac Julian fez. E você também trouxe o Julian, mas ainda no momento, em 84, né, na sua fala. Então eu queria que você fizesse esse paralelo. E aí eu acho que você mencionou, quando estava falando disso, né, de uma passagem, de uma representação mais tradicional, que aí eu estou entendendo que é o cinema, para a política da representação. Então eu queria que de repente você falasse um pouco mais sobre isso que estava na sua fala.
Okay, sure. Thanks. I'll start with the first part, which I understood as a question about the movement from cinema to art. And if I think it's really fascinating to study the beginnings of Black Audio Film Collective. This is the early 80s in Britain, and they put together this collective and began making initially slideshows. These were an early form of a quasi cinematic form that eventually were translated into film. But they were actually slideshows, and it was really important to Black Audio Film Collective to begin showing these works in places where they initially had no audience. And early on, they realized very quickly, at the time at least, this is the early 80s in Britain, that there was no audience that they could count on for Black British cinema. So they set to work in building an audience. They realized early on that they had to create the conditions of viewership, and they had to initiate a kind of collective learning and education and sharing of cinematic experience. So they would do really creative things of going to universities, of going to different communities, of showing their work in diverse contexts. So early on it wasn't exactly cinematic either, and it wasn't artistic exactly. It was a kind of I think again I'm thinking of when Fred Moten, the African American poet, when he talks about black study, it was a form of black study within the British context, studying the context of diaspora, of post-colonial experience, of migration, of what blackness meant in the British context. So early on, it's a really nebulous and flexible space that they were operating within. That gradually transformed into the space of television and the cinema theater. And they began making works that could be shown in those contexts. Because at the time in the 1980s, the art world, at least in Britain, wasn't really showing video, long video essays within a gallery framework. So that eventually changed, I think, in the 1990s, primarily, where art galleries and museums began to present videos and films as they do now today, although I think, from what I understand, the situation in Rio is still somewhat, there's still a lot of traditional limits on what you can show in galleries. But I think today, Akomfrah is still very flexible and working in diverse contexts, and it really depends on where the opportunity lies. So I think he'll make films that are destined and designed for gallery presentations. Like Vertigo C, it's a 3-channel installation that was presented at the Venice Biennale. In other words, it's made for an art gallery reception. And he'll also make work like the Stuart Hall Project, which is a feature-length cinematic release film. And he also does stuff for television. So I think he's not only a migrant in terms of geopolitics, he's a migrant in relationship to his medium. He works within diverse spaces of of dislocation. So when he says in I think it was in the Nine Muses, there's it was the Stuart Hall Project, where he says that the journey isn't always from home or to home. The journey itself can be home. I think Akomfrah is developing that concept in relationship to his film practice, where it's continually flexible and experimental in relationship to different sites of presentation. In the 80s, with Black Audio Film Collective, they were thinking about the fact that Black experience in Britain had not really been represented. And the film industry, as it existed, was largely dedicated to the experience of whiteness. And in one of their films, I think it's Handsworth Songs, they actually have there's a passage in the film where they talk about the fact that the technology of film cameras, in terms of exposure, was set to white skin and the appearance of whiteness. So it wasn't film cameras themselves were not prepared to capture black faces on film. And John Akomfrah points this out in an early essay. They were studying the racial conditions of filmmaking, in other words, in the early 80s. So that's one really important factor. Another is that Akomfrah and Black Audio realized that you can't simply shift the representation within a cinematic structure that's been dedicated to representing whiteness. You can't just take that technology and start showing the life of black people. You have to reinvent the very conditions of film technology and modes of representation. So I think that's really the revolutionary move that they make, is to insist on to ask the question, what does it mean to film blackness? As Akomfrah, he wrote an essay exactly on that topic, and the answer is you can't just use the technology of white cinema to represent black experience. You have to redesign not only the technology, but also the means of representation, and also the conventions of documentary, the conventions of fiction. You have to create a migratory, flexible, diverse, hybrid space that's one of perpetual experimentation, that attempts ultimately to overcome any kind of essentialist understanding of blackness, and opens up identity to the infinite, ultimately, to the undefinable. Right? I think that's really key to their work, as far as I understand it.
Só queria pontuar aqui um comentário do TJ sobre essa trajetória do John Akomfrah, do espaço do cinema para a galeria, que, como ele falou, essa transição não é assim tão linear, até porque o primeiro trabalho do Black Audio Film Collective, o Signs of Empire, foi exibido inicialmente no espaço da galeria. Então ele só foi fazer filmes, documentários depois de... Então o trabalho do Akomfrah nasce no espaço de exposição do museu. E essa transição entre espaços de exposição e entre mídias, ela acompanha a própria trajetória, a própria história dos filmes. O filme Nine Muses, inicialmente, foi projetado como uma videoinstalação chamada Mnemosyne. O mesmo vale para o Stuart Hall Project, que foi inicialmente uma videoinstalação de 3 canais chamada The Unfinished Conversation. Então, na própria espécie de biografia dessas obras, elas já dão testemunho desse movimento, desse deslocamento do Akomfrah por várias formas de partilhar, de exibir as imagens do movimento.
Alguém tem... Obrigado primeiro pela aula. Toca essa relação que você estabelece entre questões relacionadas às sociedades pós-coloniais. Você começa falando com Baba, né, e termina com Haraway. Eu acho que seria interessante ouvir um pouco mais essa relação que você estabelece entre questões relacionadas ao pós-colonialismo e o materialismo, esse novo materialismo que vem discutindo essa questão das espécies. Assim. Fiquei interessado nessa relação, entender um pouco mais dessa relação.
That's exactly what the talk was about. And I'm finding that there hasn't really been so much discussion of that relationship. So in Akomfrah's work, I think that's one of the achievements of his recent practice. So as a researcher and as a critic and as a writer and a curator, when I look at an artwork, I'm trying to discern what is most distinctive or what's singular about that practice. And I think this is one of the aspects of Akomfrah's, at least his recent work, that is really singular and distinctive. In terms of insisting on bringing exactly those categories, those areas together, and thinking them in relationship to each other. So on the one hand, there's the post-colonial, and I think many people are increasingly having problems with that term because it's widely, I think, agreed that we're not in a post-colonial period. We're in a colonial period still, or we're in a neo-colonial period. I mean, this continues, and it's quite evident and obvious in a range of contexts globally even. And on the other hand, the post-human, or the more than human, right? So how can we think these together? And I think as we enter into the urgent debates around climate change, we can't allow environmentalism to be a matter simply of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. I think it's crucial politically to think about climate change, because we know that climate change has uneven and disproportionate causes and disproportionate vulnerabilities and disproportionate impacts depending on where we are and who has resources and access to money and funds to be able to survive the changes in the environment, environmental transformations. And we know that people who are impoverished, typically coming from people of color, communities of color, are disproportionately exposed to toxicity and pollution and environmental violence. So for me, I think this is what Akomfrah's work is getting at. So the image here again, the enslavement, the violence, the racism, the inequalities are not necessarily only in the past here. They're also in the present, in relationship to the enjoyment of the beauty of nature. Who can enjoy the beauty of nature? This itself is a political question that's based on tremendous forms of inequality. So I think the colonial and the more than human, there's a really important political relation to be made there, so that we're not allowing environmentalism to recolonize human relations in a way. We can't let environmentalism colonize us. I think we have to insist on thinking more expansively and complexly in terms of those relations. I hope that makes sense.
Alguém teria alguma outra pergunta? A gente ainda tem alguns minutos. Não? Então acho que a gente vai encerrar por aqui.